My mother's church in Portsmouth, which Marshall know very well, has through COVID been using Evangelical Movement of Wales's recorded songs and been using those for the congregation to stand up when the music starts and sing along with them. My mother in 97, come up 98, decided that she really doesn't like this piped music. And she'd far rather we just struggle along as best we can with or without a piano sort of thing. And I said, well, that's not very well for you. But I said, a stranger comes in and they see some person at piano who can't play properly anyway. No reference to you at all. And a congregation is singing two different tunes at the same time. I said, it's not very inspiring for them to come in. So then she said, well, right now, she says, last week at the prayer meeting, and she named one particular brother. I'll not mention him because he might be known. Someone sort of chose him. He started to sing. He knew the chorus tune rightly, but he didn't know the verse tune at all. I said, it was a bit of a mess. So whatever way we do it, the Lord knows our hearts, and it is good to be with you tonight. Thanks for making the effort to be here. And if you weren't here last night, what I said I'd do would be to have a look at the book of Ruth, not by way of exposition and detailed look at each of the chapters, but to simply make it a reflection for us of how God handles our past and our present, which is tonight's theme, and then our future. And we simply said last evening, or not simply maybe, but we said that God's way of handling our past, as reflected in chapter 1, is he alludes to it. So he neither goes into that temptation that we have sometimes of ignoring the past and trying to whitewash it out of existence, nor does he allow his people to wallow in it and allow the past to enslave them for the future. He simply alludes to the facts and then gets on with the story. Tonight I'm going to look at chapters 2 and 3 roughly with you. Think of how God responds to the present. And I'm going to simply say that he responds, that he's a God who sees the situations we're in, hears our cry, knows us inside out, finds what's appropriate for us, and he's a God who is constantly responding to his people. So there's a couple of verses I want to particularly highlight, and then I'll flick through a few other points, but we'll come back to say that God is a God who is always with his people, responding to them. It's one of the brilliant things about the God we have. I think for Israel, for whom the book was written initially, this sense that God was the God to be worshipped and the king to be followed, this was an important fact. The concept of kings were dictators who had their own plan, their own purpose, and got on with it, and everyone else just had to grin and bear it. And I think God shows himself to be a God so intertwined with his people in relationship with them, that while he's working out his eternal purposes, he's also God who's continually responding to his people. You can go home now if you like. That's just not, that's kind of resume of the Let me read with you chapter 2 and then pick up a couple of verses there for you. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You've put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She had all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I work with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He's not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is a close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finished harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And we thank God for his word. One of the things that becomes very obvious when you read through chapters 2 and 3, especially if you are very well acquainted with Hebrew, which I'm not, but a smattering is enough, that you get a sense that time after time, events are being narrated by the writer of this book as though the things that are happening are pure coincidences. And we can step back and say, yeah, but we're looking at it now and we can see and be sure it's actually God at work. God was in the detail. God was responding to the present situations that were felt. But the language that's used in these two chapters is very much that human-based language that represents how Ruth and later Naomi felt about how things were happening to them and for them. So I want to give you a couple of verses and then expand from there a bit. Chapter 2, verse 3, in the NIV I'm using, it's written this way. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. As it turned out. There are several modern translations which put a slightly stronger note into that and translated, as it happened, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz. I have Bible Gateway on the computer, and it's very helpful. You have all these versions, and I went through them all, and the Jubilee Bible puts it this way. It came to pass that her lot was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. And that's probably the strongest wording I found anywhere amongst the translators. But the commentators are a bit more honest still. We said last night that in the first chapter there are some strong words that Naomi uses that translators kind of dull down a wee bit. And here in chapter 2, I think the translators do the same. And I think for obvious reasons. One commentator translates it this way: by chance, Ruth found herself gleaning in the fields that belonged to Boaz. And I can understand why lots of translators wouldn't feel very comfortable saying it's by chance that she found herself gleaning in the field belonging to Boaz. So what does the Hebrew actually say? The Hebrew is actually quite interesting. It uses two words. And if you want a literal translation, it is, by chance, she chanced upon a field that belonged to Boaz. So you actually have a double whammy of chance in that verse as originally written. I think, what a thing for Scripture to say. You know, we wouldn't dare say it that way, just like certainly in Green Island you wouldn't anyway. Maybe Ballinhinch is okay with that, but you wouldn't sort of describe Ruth's lucky breaks as a way of entitling this part of the chapter. But as we said last night, probably Samuel was the pen behind this, but it is God who's speaking. And it's God who uses this language. By chance, she chanced upon a field that belonged to Boaz. God recognizes that Ruth has no plan, no strategy, no awareness of who Boaz is or what land belongs to him, what land doesn't. Ruth and, in a sense, Naomi too have come back into this land unsure what lies ahead of them one day at a time. It's as though every day they wake up and there's new challenges and new opportunities and new needs. And what God has always wanted from his people is that ready to say, God, I can't plan today out. I don't know what lies ahead for me today, but you're my king. And I leave you to be with me, responding to all those details of my life in a way that's best from your point of view. So from Ruth's perspective, it was sheer coincidence. By chance, she chanced upon this plot of land. And yet, as God writes that, he's saying to us, surely, that my hand was in that. God works behind these divine coincidences of life. I think it was Andrew Reed who wrote some of the history of Baptist missions work in Peru. I'm not sure they entitled it Divine Coincidences or whether that just came into the writing. I couldn't find the book any longer. But that's where that phrase first came to my mind. Divine coincidences, those things that happen to us that we couldn't have planned or thought out ourselves, but in which God was at work. So go to verse 4, just in case you think I've made too much of that. How does verse 4 start? Just then, Boaz arrived. It's the same kind of language. It's out of the blue. It's unscripted. Nobody realized it was going to happen. Nobody expected it. Ruth hadn't even prayed for it. But just at that point in time where she's in a certain place, visible to those who are passing by, just then, Boaz arrives back from Bethlehem itself to where his fields are. I want to suggest to our hearts we need to read these chapters with a sense of wonder at the divine coincidences that have such a profound effect on the lives of Ruth and Naomi, and to a lesser extent, Boaz. And to understand that God's written this, not in a sense for their benefit as three people, but for the nation's benefit. He wants them as a people to trust him implicitly as a God who's working his purposes out in their lives through the things that they have no script for at all, other than what seems to be divine coincidence. And those are the two verses I want to pick on, but you read through the rest of the next two chapters and see all that happens in the narrative. And you actually say, well, you probably wouldn't use this language, but what were the odds on all those things happening in that way, at that time, in that place, with that person? So you have the fact, going back into chapter 2, verse 3, that she's said to Naomi, I'm going to go out into the fields, harvest time. All the farmers are out. All the harvesters are out. And by God's law in Deuteronomy, any stranger, any wayfarer, any needy person could follow the gleaners as they went and pick up little bits of corn or wheat that was left over. It's God's provision for the stranger and the alien. So she says to Naomi, that's where I'm going. I'm going out to a field, and I'll follow some harvesters around, and I'll glean something for ourselves. And the first field that she comes to, she's accepted. And again, you might say, well, that's probably very natural because that was the law in Deuteronomy. You had to make way for the alien and the stranger, but she was a Moabitess. And we touched last night on that hostility between Israel and Moab that went deep down into the fact that Moab had refused to give Israel bread and water on their trip into the Promised Land. And you could understand then a Moabite who comes into the Promised Land and needs to glean fields and might well expect, well, I'll have to go around a dozen fields or so before I get anyone who'll let me in to start gleaning in their field. The first field, and she's accepted. And then verse 3 of chapter 2 is Boaz's field. Lucky break, divine coincidence. What an amazing thing has happened. Verse 4, we've already mentioned Boaz arrives just then. And that's a wording of scripture. Verse 5, when Boaz comes, he spots Ruth amongst all the other women. Now, we live in a day and age where you might spot a particular woman and recognize her as different because she's wearing a different designer piece of clothing, whatever. And we all try and dress differently. But in that moment in time, most of the women would have been dressed virtually identically. And Boaz comes, greets his servants, and spots this new woman right away. What were the chances of that happening? He asks the overseer or the foreman of the workers who she was. And instantly, this man knows who she is and can give Boaz the answer he's looking for. And you go right through the rest of chapter 2 and 3. All these little things are happening. Boaz is winnowing his crops late at night, so late in the night that Ruth can go at Naomi's instruction, lay down at the foot of his bed, and then he comes and he goes to sleep and doesn't even see her there. Something startles Boaz in the middle of the night, and wakes up and finds that Ruth is there and doesn't know who she is in the pitch dark. It's as though everything that goes on in the everyday life of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz is full of these divine coincidences. We can't escape the thrust that here's a God who is responding to the needs of his children every moment, every day, every situation, every need, and every occurrence. Now we have a very strong view of divine providence and of divine sovereignty. We have no doubt, I'm sure most of us, that God is working out a big master plan that goes from eternity to eternity. I'm not saying more about that, but that's hinting at tomorrow's theme, the future. But neither can we be in any doubt that God wrote these chapters in this way for a purpose, for a reason. He's trying to communicate to his people something about how he works with them in the day-to-day of life. And God's people are called both to believe that God is the God of the big picture, the God of the eternal dimension, and yet at the same time have a conscious sense of a relationship with the gods involved in the everyday detail of our lives. And that's why I thought chapters 2 and 3 were a brilliant part of our starting of a new year. This call to us as God's people to recognize in terms of the past, God alludes to it, but he doesn't hang it around our necks to weigh us down and bog us down and stop us progressing into the future. God is with us, responding to us as his people in the present, with every care, every sigh of our human hearts, as the hymn writer puts it, every burden we bear, every sorrow, every heartbreak, every opportunity for service and work, every time that something dawns new in our lives, God's there, responding to us as his people with these divine, wonderful coincidences. And you stand back and say, well, wow, what a God we have. I think one of the earliest experiences I had that I'm aware of in my life was at the time that I was finished my second year in college, and I had asked Irish Baptist Home Mission, some of you will remember those days, if I could have a summer appointment. And they said yes, very kindly, and said they would be sending me to Waterford. Basically as far away from Belfast as they could get me, I think, probably. But Waterford had no missions worker for a while at that time, and the church had no pastor. So the plan was I'd go down there and I would preach on Sundays and midweeks. And then there's a team of young folks coming partway during the month to do some evangelistic outreach. So full of enthusiasm, I thought, Waterford's also got a bookshop. EMF were running at that time. I thought, I'll help out in the bookshop. That'd be brilliant. Great opportunity. And Waterford's a port. And when I'd lived in Scotland, I'd worked in Ardrossan in the port there, not in spiritual work, just in the shipping office. But I thought, well, there are people who work in the ports as Christians and go on board their ships. And we'd had somebody by the name of Walter Burrell, who some of you will remember from those days, who was the Seamen's Christian Friends Society's worker in Cork. And he had been in college, and I remembered him being there. So my master plan was, I'll write to Walter Burrell. I'll tell him I'm going to be down in Waterford in a couple of weeks' time. Ask if he can give me a kind of gist of what you do in terms of the port authorities to go on board their ships, and ask him what you do in terms of getting on board, the etiquette for getting to the captain, etc. So I wrote this long letter, explained who I was, how I knew him, what I wanted him to do, and waited for the response, and it never came. And I was really disappointed. And I got down to Waterford, did the first Sunday, and some of the folks said, come back to us for supper afterwards. And we went back and we started to talk about what was going to happen. I said I was really disappointed because I'd written to Walter Burrell, but he hadn't bothered to answer me. And so I was a bit nervous about how you go down onto the ships and so on. So I'm going to have to keep that one in abeyance, and maybe he'll write back in a week or two's time. This was before emails and internet and computers, etc. So no way of contacting him at that point in time. So we chatted through other stuff that evening, Edna Harper and myself and 2 or 3 folks from the church, what was going to happen, all the rest. And then the doorbell rang. And Edna went to the door, and I could hear her giggling. And she came back in with Walter Burrell. And Walter doesn't know who I am. He hasn't got any letter from me. He explains he's been away from Cork for a fortnight with children's camps. He's just been up in Dublin for a couple of days, and he's on his way home on Sunday night back down to Cork. And he said, really something strange happened. He said, I got in the car in Cork, started to drive, and he said, suddenly I thought I ought to go in to see Edna Harper in Waterford. And said, I didn't know why. I couldn't see any agenda or reason or plan or purpose in it. I said, here I am. And then the whole story fitted together. And before the evening was done, he had booked himself into my digs with me and took me on board the ships the next morning. That sense that God had brought things together in a way that we couldn't have scripted ourselves. We couldn't have planned it out that way ourselves. And all I could do was say, Lord, what a wonderful God you are, who sees what we can't see, who understands what we don't understand, who plans what we can't plan, who goes beyond all that we ever can hope for. And I guess I could spend the next fortnight here simply going through my own personal life, the series of divine coincidences, the things that have happened over and over again in different little things, some tiny little details, some massive things in life. But what a wonderful thing to have that relationship with God, where you know that he's intimately involved in the everyday present of our lives. So as I thought of broad prayer topics for us this evening, they went along this line. First of all, to thank God for the divine coincidences that you yourself have had. Because I'm sure that if I can spend a couple of weeks talking about them, you could spend just as long. Little things that God did in the recent past, in the distant past, and you'd only say, wow, what a wonderful God we have. So let's praise him for those divine coincidences. Let's affirm our trust in the providence of God for all that is unknown and unknowable to us about the year that lies ahead. One of the things that COVID has done for us, I think, helpfully, one of the blessings of COVID, if we dare talk about it that way, is it has reminded the world that we cannot actually write the script for the future. The politicians are going back to Westminster this week, not even sure if Plan B would still be operating in a fortnight's time. And we've got used, however uncomfortably, we've got used to the fact that we don't have the power to write the script for our next year, let alone further in the future. I'm not suggesting we don't plan anything or prepare anything. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is sometimes we need to say, God, you're the one who writes a script. Intercession for those whose script for life has got messed up. And there are folks around us, believers and unbelievers, who are in deep despair, who just can't see the way ahead at all. And they just need to experience a divine coincidence that will provide for them or guide them or direct them. Think of our young folk who had a career planned out for themselves. They go to university for this period of time, then they do this, and then suddenly the whole thing is thrown up in the air. They did what planning and preparation they could, but now they're left with all their plans in a mess. There are folks in business who had their 5-year plan in place, and it seemed like a sensible, proper, business-like approach to the work they're involved in. And the past couple of years has messed that up. And today they're perhaps sitting down saying, God, I don't know how to face tomorrow. Don't know what next year is going to bring. Don't know how to manage. So let's pray for those whose script has got messed up, and ask that God will give them their own set of divine coincidences, even today, even tomorrow, and make his way plain to them. So praise for what we have experienced of God, trust for ourselves for the year ahead, intercession for those who have very peculiar, very special senses of a need of God's divine coincidences.